The Neural Network by Madeline Gregorski. Read by Madison McMahon. Part 1. Top Dogs. Chapter 1. Elsie Graham sat in her attic office, leaning back in her rolling chair, a laptop open on her mahogany desk. She had bought the desk at an estate sale for $55. After she handed the cash over to the sale agent, she called up Basil and broke the news of what she had done. Then she asked if he could borrow his brother's work van and come pick her and the desk up. She had expected him to be upset. It was a non-necessity, and there were more important things to be spending money on. Instead, he told her everyone deserved a luxury, and did as she asked. Most of the drive home was spent devising a plan on how to get the large desk up into their fourth-floor apartment. When they were certain they knew what to do, everything fell apart. They realized they wouldn't be able to fit in the elevator alongside the desk. They were forced to send the desk up alone and made a mad dash up the stairs to catch it before it was sent back down. When they did finally get it into their apartment, they immediately realized that it would not fit through their bedroom door as intended. As much as it frustrated them, all they could do was laugh as they came to terms with the fact that the desk's final resting place would be in the corner of their small living room. 2 years later, when they moved into their house, they could afford to have someone move the desk for them. But secretly, Elsie almost wished they would have to move it themselves, because, in the end, it was a memory she looked back at fondly. Now the desk had its own room where it could be the centerpiece. As she sat at that desk each day, she found herself tracing her fingers over the water stains from all the time they had set glasses on it. As her fingers ran around those circular water stains, she pulled herself from her thoughts and back into reality. When she had returned her attention back to the document page, a knock fell on the doorframe. She swiveled around to see Basil in the doorway, a single hand on the withered bronze knob and a shoulder against the door jamb. He smiled at her as he entered the room, grabbed her reading chair from the far corner, and dragged it over to her side. He flopped onto it, leaned back, and prepared himself to listen to Elsie's typical spiel, which was usually an explanation of why her desk was such a mess. Instead, she pulled her knees up to her chest, threw her head back, and groaned. "So I take it it's not going too well," Basil said. "Terrible. Total writer's block." "How far in are you?" Elsie flipped around her laptop and showed him the empty document. "Nothing." "Okay, well, beginnings are the hardest part, right?" he said. "So just write the middle." She slumped forward. "That's the problem. I don't have a beginning, middle, or end. I have no ideas at all." "Okay then," Basil thought for a moment. "You just need a little inspiration." She raised her brows. "A little?" He rolled his eyes. "Well, you always say that people watching is the best way to write characters, right?" He paused, then finished with, "And I might be able to help with that." She leaned forward. "All right," she said, clearly skeptical. Basil took a deep breath and ran a hand through his thick black hair. "We finally finished our latest project last week, so the company is holding something to celebrate. And it would be nice if you tagged along." Basil could tell the blank look on her face was an attempt to hide her distaste for the idea. "And that's basically people watching, right?" She heaved in a deep breath and considered. She had never particularly enjoyed social events, especially the ones at Basil's work. It wasn't that she was disinterested in his work. It was more that she didn't understand it. She did attend work events semi-frequently. The ones they held at the lab, the Christmas parties, and even those times when his co-workers would gather to drink as friends rather than colleagues. And she hated it. Of course, there was a point in time when she did enjoy it, socializing with all the people Basil knew and liked. But as time went on, she slowly became nothing more than a shadow to Basil. With a cup of cheap red wine in one hand, and the other stuffed in her pocket, she would wait for a moment to slip away and scroll through her phone. The talk Basil's coworkers made with her was superficial at best. What she thought were genuine conversations were not meaningful at all. They were simply a means of belittling her. After tolerating it for a while, she finally decided to keep to herself during these occasions. She would have to give Basil credit, though. He had picked a clever way to sell the idea. "You don't have to," Basil assured her. "I understand if you're busy." Basil knew full well she wasn't busy. Elsie folded her hands in her lap. She knew she didn't have much of a choice, as she had put off the last few events. Though she knew Basil tried not to take it personally, it was clear that with each new rejection, his patience grew thinner. "No, it's all right," she lied. "It's been a while since I've seen everyone." Basil beamed. "I'm sure they'll be happy to see you." "I'm glad." Science was something Elsie understood on a strictly need-to-know basis. Sure, she was a science fiction writer, but she only needed to know the bare bones of the real world. How disease spreads, the side effects of certain drugs, what gases make up a planet's atmosphere, physics, biology, chemistry. But some concepts were simply too intangible for her to grasp. Basil once suggested the reason publishers hadn't picked up one of her books yet was because her misunderstanding of the scientific world led into her writing. Although he had quickly gone back on his word, deep down she had almost believed him, because 2 published novels later, she only ever found her books on the clearance table, untouched. In 3 years, she had never received a single royalty check. "Don't worry," Basil said. "We won't stick around long." "You always say that," she grumbled. Basil set a gentle hand on her thigh. "Only an hour or 2, I swear." She sighed and tucked her long bangs behind her ear. "All right, love. Do you want me to leave you alone now?" Elsie swiveled around to face her laptop. "Start dinner, maybe? Or put a pot of water on if you're not feeling up to it." Basil stood up and ran his fingers through her thin blonde hair. "I think I can manage." A slight smile crossed her lips. "I love you, Baz. I love you more." He bent over and kissed the top of her head before he dragged the reading chair back to the corner and left. Elsie tapped the trackpad to wake up her laptop, centered the cursor, and wrote out the only thing she could think of. Elsie M. Graham. She watched the cursor blink for a few more minutes, hoping something would come to her until she finally realized it was a lost cause. She got up and stretched herself out, then wandered across the room to the bookshelves that lined the far wall. She ran her fingers across the spines as she thought about what she wanted to read. Her eyes scanned slowly upwards until she picked one, plucked it off the shelf, and threw herself down into her plush red reading chair. She had started the book a while back, but never found the time to finish it, which was clear from the dust that coated the cover. She wiped it off and opened Kurt Vonnegut's Cat's Cradle. As she flipped to the next page, one particular line caught her eye. "All of the true things I am about to tell you are shameless lies." She wondered how often that was true. Elsie only made it through the first 3 chapters before Basil cracked open the door and beckoned her back downstairs for dinner. She dog-eared the page, bounced down to the first floor, and took her seat at the dining room table. "I did my best," Basil said, as he stepped from the attached kitchen with a plate in each hand. She picked up her fork and took a bite of the carbonara as Basil settled himself into his own chair. "I think you're getting better," Elsie said. "Better than last time, for sure." "Be nice," he replied with a laugh. "There's no need to brag. Everyone knows you're the better cook." "It's not my fault I have talent." "You're just built for it," Basil shrugged, before he added, "So you'll come tomorrow? For sure?" Elsie pressed her lips into a fine line. "Yes, I'll come tomorrow." "Thank you, Elle." When they were finished, Elsie gathered up the plates and left to do the dishes. Basil sat himself down in the living room to put on a movie, and Elsie joined him after she started the dishwasher. They sat there, cuddled up on the sofa, until 10 o'clock, when Basil, as he did every night, said, "I think it's time for bed." Elsie silently agreed and carried out the same nightly routine they had each weekday. She bumbled up the stairs to return to the bedroom, where she flicked on the light and began to strip off her day clothes. She tossed them to the floor as she dug around her bureau for a new set of pajamas. Basil collected her laundry off the floor, while she pushed past their bed's silk canopy and flopped down onto the soft mattress. Basil came over and straightened out the sheets a bit before he crawled into bed. Elsie slipped beneath the covers, rolled over, and snuggled up against him. She kissed him softly before she laid her head atop his chest. "I love you, Basil," Elsie whispered. He patted her head. "I love you more." He took in a deep breath, then said, "You don't need to be worried about tomorrow." Elsie sat up to look at him. "What do you mean?" "You always seem anxious before I bring you into work." She shrugged. "I just don't understand it, is all." She decided to skip the parts about his coworkers' subpar treatment of her. Understand what? Well, she took a moment to choose her words carefully. It's hard to engage when you don't really know what your husband works on. Basil frowned. You don't need to know. Isn't spousal privilege a thing? Not when you're under an NDA. Basil kissed the top of her head. I would tell you if I could, Elle. I understand. I know you don't, Basil cooed, but I appreciate that you pretend to. You're welcome. He took in a breath, then said, All right, I think we need to get some sleep. Elsie rolled onto her right side. Basil tugged her close and curled up around her. He ran his thumb over her arm and assured her, You'll be okay tomorrow. I know. I'm choosing to believe you. Elsie fell asleep in Basil's arms. Chapter 2. Elsie put off getting ready for as long as she could. As much as she hoped Basil would come in and tell her the event was unexpectedly canceled, she still found herself curling her long blonde hair in the bathroom mirror, while trying to simultaneously apply mascara to her soft blue eyes. Not even an hour later, she was in the passenger seat of Basil's car as he parked in the corporate building's lot. When they entered the building, Basil tapped them through 2 sets of double doors, where they were greeted by a receptionist at a tall, round desk. She was a pretty woman. She wore her dark hair around her shoulders and matched the color of her low-cut top to the shade of her red lipstick. Basil offered a charming smile, tapped his employee ID on the scanner, then said, Hey, Britt, I need a guest badge. Sure, Britt purred. Name and ID, please. She might already be in the system. Britt tapped at the keyboard, then looked to Elsie. Elsie McCarthy? It's Graham now, Elsie corrected. Britt's sensual tone immediately turned to one of irritation. She huffed a snappy reply. Relationship to employee? Before Elsie had a chance to bark a response, Basil answered, Wife. Elsie set her driver's license down on the desk. Britt plucked it off the counter and held it up to the photo in their computer system, and quietly scoffed. We might need to take a new photo. She pointed to the long scar that ran down Elsie's collarbone. Your appearance changed. Elsie touched the scar gently, then covered it with her hand. She had hidden it for the past 6 months, from the time the stitches were sewn in until long after they were removed. She knew the black dress's plunging neckline wouldn't hide the scar. Basil had told her no one would notice, and if they did, they wouldn't say anything. But there she was, embarrassed over the mark on her body before she had even stepped foot in the event hall. Britt tossed her ID back onto the counter before she hit a button that raised a camera out from behind the desk, the same kind they had used at the DMV when she got her license for the first time last year. She looked at the little red dot, and the camera flashed, then lowered. While Elsie's eyes readjusted, the printer behind the reception desk began gurgling as it spat out a black and white slip of paper. Britt pulled it off the paper tray, stuffed it into a plastic case, attached a metal clip, and handed it to Elsie. Have a good night, Britt said, sneering. Elsie was mortified to see how prominent the scar was in the photo. If that weren't enough, in large print below, it read, Elsie McCarthy. Basil thanked Britt, then grabbed Elsie's hand and guided her deeper into the building. I'll make sure it gets updated, he assured Elsie. Why wasn't it updated when we were married? Elsie snapped back quietly. You need to be here for it to be changed, Basil returned. So relax. How do you know her? I come down here on Fridays for meetings. You tap in, so why do you need to talk to her? Elsie, Basil took in a deep breath. I get that you're stressed out, but you can't take it out on me. Elsie muttered something to herself before she said to Basil, I don't like her. Basil rolled his eyes. No one's wife does. Elsie knew she should appreciate Basil's friendliness, that he was so personable, likable, that he could have a conversation for both of them. But she loathed conversations like the one he had with Britt, the ones where women mistook his sincerity for flirting and became unpleasant when they realized Basil was married. She knew her jealousy only masked her anxiety, but she hated that Basil continued to stay amicable with people like her. She knew it was simply because he still needed to harbor a professional relationship with her. So Elsie did her best to say nothing too unreasonable. She pushed the thoughts aside, as Basil guided her through the building and up to the 10th floor, where large event halls were held. They turned a corner, and he led her into a hall she hadn't seen before. "This isn't the usual place," Elsie said. "They're unveiling it first," Basil explained. "What?" "Don't worry about it," Basil waved her off. "You'll see." They entered through a set of double doors and were greeted by a large auditorium-like room. It lacked seating, but there was a large stage at the center, with a long runway that led to a circular platform stationed in the center of the room to better illuminate the catwalk. Though she understood the function, Elsie couldn't help but think about how it was an atrocious way to design a room, practically and aesthetically. When she briefly turned back, she could see the professional camera crews setting up their equipment into the corner. She took one last deep breath before she and Basil descended into the dense crowd. Basil looked as if he already knew where he was headed, close to the far wall where a group of other managers was circled up, lost in conversation. Elsie clung to his hand as he dragged her through the hordes of people. Basil gently pushed his way into the group, and everyone greeted him with wide smiles, but said nothing to Elsie. She knew better than to break the facade, and she kept her fake smile as she feigned interest. The man to her left, whom she was certain she had met before, but failed to remember his name, turned to her and said, "Elsie, how's the writing?" "It's going well, thank you." He hummed. "I saw one of your books at one of the local shops the other day." "Oh, really?" She perked up a bit. Most places still stock them, but people don't quite realize it since they get swallowed up by the larger books on the shelves. Right, the man drawled. "It wasn't on the shelf. I saw it on one of the tables, in the back." Her shoulders slumped. The clearance table. She could tell by the sly smirk on his face he wanted to get a rise out of her. The nameless man frequently attempted to make conversation with her. Often something absurd, like neuroscience, genome sequences, and once, quantum mechanics. She knew his only intention was to try and garner her praise for his knowledge, but when she didn't offer it, he simply started talking down to her. It didn't bother her, though, because the more he talked, the clearer it became that even he didn't know what he was talking about. Basil was caught up in his own conversation, which the man re-entered when he realized Elsie wouldn't react the way he wanted. She turned to look around the room, to find a familiar face, anyone who she might be able to really engage with. In the far corner of the room, next to the fire exit, was someone she recognized. They wore the same disinterested face she wished she too could wear. She tugged on Basil's sleeve and said, "I'm going to talk to Jay." Basil nodded, but she was sure he hadn't heard what she said. Her fake smile turned to a genuine one as she approached the man. When he finally noticed her, he pushed himself off the wall to greet her. "Well, if it isn't Miss Elsie Graham," he said with a smile. Elsie laughed. "It's good to see you, Jay." "I didn't expect to see you here." She shrugged. "The things we do for love, right?" He chuckled. "How are you? I don't see you nearly enough. I tried to text Basil about going to dinner sometime, but the message just bounced back." "That's an easy fix. I can just give you mine," Elsie said, as she held out her hand. Jay nodded and handed his phone over. She plugged her phone number in and created a new contact for herself. "Problem solved. How's work been?" Elsie was never great at conversation, let alone transitioning from one topic to another. It had always been call and response to her, though she did do her best to make it all sound natural. She knew everyone noticed, and she was sure Jay did too, but he never seemed to act as if it were odd like everyone else. Though she was still somewhat embarrassed, she felt more at ease when talking with him compared to the rest of Basil's coworkers. "It's Curie. How good can it be?" Jay laughed. "It's fine. My department didn't play too big of a role in this project, so we've been stuck with busy work the past few months. But if I can get paid to pretend I'm working, I'll take it." "So, how much longer do you think we're going to be stuck waiting for this unveiling?" Jay shrugged. "I don't know, but I'm ready to be done with it. There's really no need to drag it on for so long. It's Curie employees, for Christ's sake. They either show up early or they don't show up at all." And before Elsie even had a chance to reply, Jay's eyes widened and he pointed to the stage. The overhead lights dimmed while the floodlights grew brighter. She whispered around to see a man saunter. "Speak of the devil," Elsie muttered. Chapter 3. The room fell silent at the sight of him. Alexander Porter, the founder of Curie Industries. He was a younger man. Wrinkles hadn't yet taken to his face, but gray streaks dashed his thin brown hair. He almost looked underdressed for the occasion, a pair of dark-washed jeans and a yellow flannel shirt. Somehow, his confidence almost made up for the lack of professional dress. Porter looked at the people below him and took in a deep breath before he announced, "Welcome!" He paused so everyone could take a moment to let the privilege of his presence sink in before he dove into the same spiel every founder did. "It's great to see both familiar and unfamiliar faces. It really goes to show how much manpower and collaboration is necessary for things like this." He took another pause, then went on to praise friends and family for their support and attendance. The same old superficial bullshit they always spat at these sort of things. And that's when the curtains drew back. 3 border collies paraded down the stage in a single file line. When they reached Porter and his circle, they all sat down side by side. Porter took a moment to look at the dogs before he returned his attention to the crowd. Elsie twisted around to look at Jay. "Dogs?" Jay nodded. "Yep, dogs." "Meet my 3 friends," Porter said with a smile. "Sophie, Lucky, and Athena. All 3 are Curie-developed service animals. I wanted to bring everyone here before we started the party so I could show off the extent of these animals' capabilities, to show off what the members of Curie Industries have been working on these past few years." He reached down and patted Lucky, who sat between Sophie and Athena. Without another word, he began to command tasks of the dogs while briefly explaining the purpose of each one. Sophie alerted a handler for a seizure, then herded the closest person back to her owner for help. Porter had Athena guide her blind handler around the stage area, up the stairs, and down the platform. Then they were left with Lucky, who spent most of his time retrieving different items by name, and also performed compression therapy. Elsie was baffled by the swiftness of the dogs' actions, how they each performed the tasks precisely and without hesitation. Everyone was mesmerized by the obedience of the animals. Elsie scanned over each of the dogs' bodies, Sophie's muscled legs, Athena's split-colored face, Lucky's unusually large stature. Sophie and Athena had the same black and white coat. Lucky was a shade of deep brown that faded into a caramel color around the lower lengths of his legs. His belly was white, as was the stripe up his snout and down the top of his head. But that dark brown covered the remainder of his face and back. "Their abilities are identical," Porter said, "and all of them were developed in a Curie lab, but only one was created there." He was offered nothing but silence. "Sophie and Athena are products of genetic engineering. We have almost guaranteed that they will never succumb to common health-based consequences we often see in purebred dogs. They likely won't have to retire early and will be free from unnecessary pain." "Genetic engineering," Elsie muttered to herself. Porter then sent Sophie and Athena off the stage and continued. "But then we have Lucky." Lucky stood before Porter with his head held high. "Lucky is a machine." A wave of quiet mumbles washed over the room before it fell dead silent once more. Now, what makes Lucky such a special robot isn't just his visual replication, or his ability to perform tasks as cleanly and quickly as living dogs. Lucky is the world's first independently functioning piece of artificial intelligence. He is one of the most intricate neural networks to have ever been developed. He learns through experience, pattern recognition, and play. "No way." Elsie looked behind her to Jay. "He's unbelievable." "Scary, isn't it?" "Scary?" Elsie cocked her head to the side. "Jay, you worked on it." Jay chuckled. "I may work for Curie, but that doesn't mean I always know what I'm working on. When it comes to things like this, those of us who work on the mechanics are kept in the dark for as long as possible. Only the software department is fully aware of what's going on." "What?" Jay took a moment to think. "I did help build the dog. We were originally told to build bits and pieces with no further information on the project. It wasn't until I was called in to help assemble Lucky's exoskeleton that I finally found out where all of these machine parts we'd been developing were going. Half the Curie employees are finding out about Lucky at the same time as you, the general public. How's that scary? Elsie said. Just seems like a poor work structure. All right, now think about all of that put together. You don't get to know what you're working on, and when you finally find out it's a machine dog that you can't even tell apart from the others, even I couldn't tell them apart. Get to the point, please. How long until I'm working on a hyper-realistic AI human and I don't even know it? Okay, whoa. Dog to human is a massive jump, Jay, Elsie said. Think about it. If we can hardly tell that's a fake dog, what happens when they make a robotic human that even its creators can't recognize? You're thinking too hard about this. I'm thinking about the future, the consequences of stuff like this, consequences we can mitigate if we cut this out sooner rather than later. Consequences are something best adapted to, Elsie said. I think. Before Elsie had a chance to answer, Lucky barked and interrupted Porter's speech. Porter took a moment to let the crowd's laughter die out before he continued. In line with Curie's values, Lucky is still a piece of medical equipment. He is a near-perfect service animal, a guide dog, a response dog, an emotional support animal. Lucky will never miss an alert, will always be by your side, and will never falter as a live animal might. Elsie had always wanted a dog, but Basil had always been opposed. He had a slew of reasons, all of which she found nonsensical. They were dirty, loud, and sometimes aggressive. She had tried to compromise with a cat, but he was adamant he didn't want any live animals in the house. She wouldn't lie and say it didn't disappoint her, but she stopped her attempt to convince him a year ago when the neighbor's dog got out and nearly bit Basil. It didn't take long for Elsie to tune Porter back out, because now she was fixated on Lucky, on how something so fake could look so real. She traced up from his paws, up to his snout, and then she stared into his eyes. They responded to stimuli, with no reaction time, and moved from side to side when people moved or whispered a bit too loud. But there was no iris. His eyes were just black balls inside a steel skull. And it was only his eyes that unsettled her, the way he watched over everyone with such a blank stare. She knew those eyes took in information and stored it somewhere with everything else. Information that she may be in the background of. She knew it didn't make a difference, though. It was like anything else. The way people used VPNs to hide IP addresses, covered their laptop cameras, or used incognito tabs. It was an extra precaution. And though everyone knew it was a lost cause, they still took those extra protective measures and pretended like all their private information would stay private. But Elsie knew she couldn't keep herself separated from the hidden servers on the internet. And it was things like Lucky that reminded her of that. With the way Lucky looked around, she couldn't pretend. Porter's voice finally faded out, and he turned and walked off the stage, but left Lucky behind on the platform. Jay rolled off the wall and said to her, "I'll text you, Elle. Let's catch up sometime." Then he disappeared out the fire exit before she had a chance to even say goodbye. And while she almost went to follow him through the door, she stayed frozen in place as the rest of the crowd began to dissipate. When the people had almost entirely filed out, she inched closer toward the stage. She wanted to meet the dog. She waited until everyone had left for the after-party before she approached the stage. It was only her and the dog. At first, she solely looked at the dog, until she found herself reaching to touch him. The dog moved closer, slid down into a laying position, and dipped his head down for her to pet him. She ran her hand across his body, her fingers going down his side as she took in the different textures of his shaggy fur. She was astonished at how each of his individual hairs was so well crafted, you couldn't tell they were artificial. You would never even know the pattern was manufactured. It looked like an algorithm spat out a Punnett square, and they handcrafted each individual gene, right down to each strand of DNA. She let the rest of the world melt away as she brushed her hands against him. The two simply enjoyed one another's company. Then she planted two hands on the lip of the stage and hauled herself up onto it. She sat beside Lucky and looked out at the large, empty room, just to give herself a moment to unwind from it all before she dove back in at the after-party. "He's hypoallergenic." She whipped around where Porter towered over her. "It's soft," she stuttered, her voice hardly above a whisper. "It's so real." "Thank you." Porter sat down beside her. "We wanted to start small." "I wouldn't call this small." He chuckled. Small becomes a lot bigger the more technology evolves. Lucky pawed at her, then rolled over so Elsie could rub his belly. She couldn't help but smile as she scratched at him. She truly did have a soft spot for animals, especially ones who loved the attention she loved to give them. Why an alert dog? I think sometimes people don't realize how important service animals can be. But why not stop at the genetic engineering? Well, a lot of reasons. He took a moment to think. If things develop as planned, he could be a great accessible and affordable tool. No allergies, no extra expenses, just a one-time cost and you're set for life. And if I'm being totally honest, I'm like anyone else. I have dreams, passions, desires, and sometimes I like to indulge myself. My first and truest love has always been artificial intelligence, and I figured I could do something important with it. Don't get me wrong, I take great pride in my work. I save lives and I couldn't ask for anything more. But it's nice to take a break every so often. He ran a hand down Lucky's back. Who are you? Elsie folded her hands in her lap. Elsie Graham, Basil Graham's wife. He's a software engineer. So you're the wife, he smiled. I've heard plenty about you. I know Basil well. He's a very talented man. Creates exceptional work. She chuckled. I definitely got lucky. I'm Lex. He stuck out his hand. It's great to finally meet you. They shook hands. You too. You're a writer, he said, a statement, not a question. I am, she said sheepishly. She had never been ashamed of her work, not like she was right now. But now that she stared into the eyes of the sultan of the med-tech world and admitted she was uneducated, she almost felt inadequate. Her husband was something magnificent. Anyone could recognize that. Yet somehow his wife was unexceptional. Lucky picked up his head and nudged Elsie's arm. You're nervous, Lex noted. Don't be nervous. I try not to be, Elsie said. I have anxiety. I can't always help it. Lucky moved closer, lifted his head, and set it in her lap. You know, Lex began, Lucky is designed to be a psychiatric assistance dog. She hesitated. But how does he know? It's learned behavior. He spent a good deal of time with other service animals and their owners to help him learn the signals. And eventually, he develops pattern recognition, so he knows what to look out for. He's mimicking, in a way. He stores previous information in order to use it in the future. So he can tell when I'm nervous? Your tone of voice, the way you move, the look on your face. Lex leaned back. All of those things are tells, and he performs his task when he notices them. He nudges you to let you know you might experience an episode. Wow, Elsie muttered. Have you ever considered a therapy animal? Lex asked. Elsie smiled as she thought about having a dog in the house. I've always wanted one, but Basil doesn't particularly like animals. Lucky isn't an animal. He's a machine. Elsie laughed. If you hadn't told me, I wouldn't have known. There was a moment of silence. Take him home. Elsie's eyes widened. No, absolutely not. This is a massive breakthrough. You can't just give him to me. He's a prototype, 1 of 7. I don't need him, Lex said. Take him. I can't. If I need him back, I'll have Basil bring him. Lex reached over and patted Lucky's head. He'll be happy to do his job. He's designed to be an emotional support animal. You'll get more use out of him than I will. Elsie rubbed her arm. It was true. She could certainly benefit from Lucky's support, and Basil had little reason to turn the dog down. Lucky was everything Elsie wanted, minus everything Basil hated. But she couldn't just bring Lucky home. I'd have to ask Basil. Lex threw his head back and laughed. He made the dog. I'm sure he would love to reap the benefits of his own creation, to help his wife no less. Lex didn't give Elsie time to find another excuse. Let's compromise. We'll do a trial run. 2 weeks, you and the dog. If you don't want him, I'll come back and get him. No questions asked, no hard feelings. He pulled out a business card and slipped it into his hand. This is my number. Feel free to call whenever. Of course, Basil is welcome to call himself, too. She looked at the card before she slipped it into her dress pocket. I think Basil's at the after-party right now. Well, go then, Lex said as he jumped off the stage and offered her his hand. There's more than enough alcohol to get you through the rest of the night. Elsie always thought she had a good poker face. "Oh, I should be fine. I enjoy these things," she stammered. "No, you don't," Lex said. "Anyone who likes these things is either crazy or a liar." Elsie chuckled as Lex waved her from the room. Just before she crossed the threshold, she looked back to him. "Aren't you coming?" "Of course not," Lex grinned. "I hate these sorts of things." All she could do was laugh and leave. Part 2. Get Lucky. Chapter 4. She followed the soft orchestral music down the hall until she was greeted by a set of open double doors. People stood in the entryway and seemed to slowly spill out into the corridor as they floated further and further from the event hall. She took a deep breath, put on her best smile, and entered the after-party. A small bar was stationed to her left. The people in its line caught up in conversation as they inched forward. She made a quick mental note of the bar's location before she dove deeper into the room in search of her husband. Elsie cursed the unintentional uniform of men at semi-formal events. White button-down, black slacks, and a muted tie. She scanned the crowd for a tall, dark-haired man without a woman hanging off his side. She felt a tap on her shoulder and turned to find Basil there, his bright green eyes glinting against the bright fluorescent lights. Basil held a flute of pink champagne in one hand and a half-empty plastic cup of red wine in the other. He held out the bubbly drink to Elsie as he sipped from his own cup. She took it and didn't hesitate before bringing it to her lips and downing the whole glass. "I need another one of these," she said as she moved to join the line for the bar. Basil stifled laughter as he caught the sleeve of her dress. "Where have you been that you needed to do that?" "Caught up in conversation, and you know how much I love that," she said sarcastically. "We both need another drink." "Not me. I have to drive us home," Basil returned. "Who were you talking to?" Basil had always been picky about which of his coworkers Elsie should talk to. He wanted to be around during those conversations, but he never offered an explanation as to why. Eventually, she did put her foot down and demand an answer, and that's when Basil had spewed some nonsense about the differences. She had once gotten to talking to another supervisor, and Basil nearly got angry at her, but cooled himself off and explained that the supervisor was a sleazy guy, and he was more concerned than upset. After a while, Basil eased up on the adamancy of his presence, and left Elsie to do as she pleased, even if he still had an obvious distaste for it. Either way, Elsie was sure Basil would not take the news of her chat with Lex too well. But she knew the truth rarely stayed hidden. "Lex." "Lex?" Basil asked, wide-eyed. "As in Lex Porter?" Elsie doubled down. "Yes." "Elsie, are you kidding? You know how I feel about—" Basil stopped himself, took in a shaky breath, and calmed himself. "We need to go to the car. Let's go to the car." Basil tangled his hand in hers and began to guide them out of the event hall. Elsie fumbled beside him until she flicked his hand away and shakily pulled off her heels and met his pace, barefoot. As they reached the end of the hall, Elsie finally said, "Don't do that. I can't keep up in heels. It hurts." "I'm sorry," Baz sputtered as they entered the elevator. He tapped his foot the entire elevator ride down, and nearly shoved her out of it. But before he had a chance to drag Elsie out of the building with him, she halted at the reception desk where Britt was still stationed. Elsie had accidentally stolen a champagne flute from the party, and though she knew it would be fine if she walked out with it, she set it down at the reception desk and said, "Return that for me? Thanks, Brie." Britt sneered as Basil pushed Elsie out the front door. Basil refused to speak to Elsie until they were in the car, no matter how much she nagged. He locked the car doors, caught his breath, then said, "What did he tell you?" Elsie crossed her arms. "Why do you need to know?" "Because I need to know." Basil's sharp gaze didn't waver. "What did he tell you?" A moment of vicious silence permeated the car. The quiet stung Elsie hard enough that she confessed. "He offered me the dog." Basil paled. "He gave you the dog?" "No, he offered me the dog," she corrected. "Is something wrong?" Basil rubbed the back of his neck. "Okay, well, I'll call him about it." Elsie tilted her head. "So you do want the dog?" "He and I need to talk," Basil breathed. Another moment of brief silence hung over them. Elsie brushed loose hair from her face and tucked it behind her ear. "Do we have to go back inside?" When Basil said nothing, she added, "I have a headache." Basil perked up. "What's wrong?" Elsie turned to look out the window. "I think it's anxiety." "Maybe you should get checked out again," Basil said, "to make sure everything's okay." Elsie always had medical issues. Her heart suffered from palpitations and dysrhythmia. A lung had collapsed once after she went running, and just 6 months ago, she had to have surgery to stabilize her collarbone after she broke it falling down the stairs. Not to mention the surgeries she'd had as a clumsy child. Not that she remembered. "I'll consider it if it doesn't go away by tomorrow." "All right." She could see Basil shake as he tried to plug the key into the ignition. When the engine finally sputtered on, he set the car into gear and peeled out of the parking lot. The car ride felt non-existent. When Elsie came to, she found herself in the shower. She brushed wet hair from her face and set her head against the wall. She breathed in the steam and listened to the droplets hit the tile floor and gurgle before they swirled down the drain. Basil hadn't come into the bedroom with her, let alone the shower. He paced up and down the hallway while on the phone. Elsie could hear his faint voice and the creak of the floorboards, but it wasn't just the shower's rattle that concealed his voice. It was a hushed conversation, and behind their home's thicker walls, anything she might have been able to make out was nothing more than a muffled garble of inaudible noise. She pushed it aside. It wasn't unusual for her to be kept in the dark, so she took in another breath and let her mind wander to other places. Elsie turned off the tap and slid the frosted shower door open. She toweled off as cool air mixed with the once-trapped heat. She shivered as she hung the towel back up and stepped out of the shower. It was then that she wished she had taken a longer shower. The steam hadn't coated the mirror enough to hide her reflection. It had only mottled it. As the fog quickly dissipated, she was left to stare at herself in the mirror that she had begged Basil to put elsewhere. When she saw her naked body in the mirror, Elsie was always immediately greeted with the slew of scars she didn't remember earning. They were large, discolored slashes on her skin, lined with dots from where she had been sutured up. Elsie ran her fingers under her left breast, where the largest scar stained her skin. She wished they weren't so visible, because maybe then she could pretend that they didn't exist at all. She could look at the top half of her body in the mirror and see the same image every other woman did. And the way her profile looked in Curie's database, the way Britt looked at her with such disgust, it almost solidified everything Elsie thought about herself, about the things she could never change. Basil said all wounds heal with time, but she disagreed. There would always be a reminder etched into her skin. Basil stepped through the doorway. "The scars, they're not worth thinking about." "It's not unreasonable to want to know." "You do know." Elsie frowned. "Not the way other people do. Half of my life is secondhand stories. Do you know how terrifying that is?" She wrapped her arms around her body. "I can't even remember my own traumas." "Why would you want to remember something so terrible?" "Because it's my life, Basil. Because maybe then I could remember their faces." She looked down at the floor. "Because I could know what actually happened, how it actually happened. I could see the jaws of life and be thankful for the people who saved me, people whose faces I don't even know. Elsie, because I would know no one was lying." She finally looked at Basil. "People could have said whatever they wanted. The doctors, the social workers, anyone. Do you know how terrifying it is to place the entirety of your childhood in the hands of someone you've never met?" Basil stepped forward and engulfed her in a tight hug. "I wish you could know, Elsie. I really do. But wishing isn't worth the worry." "Why not?" Elsie pushed Basil away. Elsie wasn't just upset that she didn't remember her early life. She was terrified. Therapists, psychologists, and psychiatrists. Each of them had told her the same thing. It was a trauma response. Her brain decided to wipe everything and start over. She didn't understand why it tossed everything else out, why it didn't just scrap the car accident and let her keep the rest. Anytime she vocalized her frustrations, she was always met with the same answer. Trauma does weird things to the brain. "I know I'll never understand. I know that. But you're stressed out. You're tired. We can talk about this in the morning when you've rested, when you're thinking straight," Basil answered. Elsie took a deep breath and accepted that Basil might be right, even if she was still upset. "Okay." "Good." Basil guided her out of the bathroom, where she pulled on her pajamas and slipped into bed. She settled under the blankets and patted around for her phone, then found it on her nightstand where Basil had plugged it in. She didn't know when the rest of the world would find out about Lucky, but she hadn't expected the news to break that night. And just as she had predicted, Lucky turned the world upside down. She watched the videos of him over and over, as he ran down the walkway, performed tasks, and sat patiently. She even watched the short clips of him begging invitees for attention at the edge of the stage. She couldn't help but get sucked in. He was designed to be likable. Basil shimmied under the blankets and leaned over to look at her home screen. What are people saying? Elsie took another moment to skim through more comments. Some think it's useless, some think it's dangerous. The rest love it. Basil scoffed. Dangerous? People watch too many movies. Just because it's artificial intelligence doesn't mean it's some bloodthirsty robot. He's designed to save lives, for Christ's sake. Some people are real dumbasses. Elsie shrugged. I spoke to Jay today. I don't like Jay. You don't like a lot of people. But I especially don't like Jay. I don't like how he looks at you. And I know he would cheat on his wife if he was given the opportunity. Elsie chose to say nothing about Britt, the receptionist. Look, I'm not saying he's right, but he did make some good points about our relationship with AI in the future. Are you really giving Jay Donovan the benefit of the doubt right now? Same guy who bought a $100,000 timeshare in a hurricane-prone area without telling his wife? No, Elsie corrected. I'm giving him credit for almost critically thinking. Imagine a human AI so perfectly crafted it could walk and talk among us and not a single person would know it's a machine. That's absurd. Basil rubbed his eyes with one hand. That's fucking ridiculous. A lot of things used to be absurd. Airplanes, spaceships. Basil heaved in a frustrated breath and cut her off. Elsie, take it from someone who worked on it. There is nothing to be afraid of. Lucky isn't ready to be released to the public, and Lex has no plans to release or even sell the software. I never said I believed it, just a creepy thought. Well, don't think too hard, Basil warned. It's bad for you. There was a beat of silence. Good night, Elsie, Basil said flatly, before he grabbed the blankets, tugged them up, and rolled over to fall asleep. Good night, Baz, she said quietly. So Elsie laid there and thought about all the things Lex, Basil, and Jay had said to her. How it left her brain caught between a fear of advancement, the consequences of humanity's curiosity, and a fascination with all the things that forced her to rethink the world as she knew it. Chapter 5. Elsie reluctantly pulled herself out of bed the next morning. She wandered downstairs to the kitchen and put on a pot of coffee, bumbling around as she gathered what she needed to make breakfast. Just as she was about to turn on the stove, the doorbell rang. She huffed and grumbled something about Mormon missionaries and solicitors as she rushed to the other side of the house. She put her eye to the peephole and immediately opened up when she saw who was at her door. Lex Porter. Lex, hi! As the words left her mouth, she realized the state she was in, pajamas with her hair in an unimaginable state. She only grew more embarrassed when she looked at the clock above the door and realized it was nearly noon. I'm so sorry for my appearance. I'm a night owl. My day starts late, she blurted. Oh, who cares? A smart person wears comfortable clothes. You can't focus on your work when you're worried about the iron creases on your pants, he said. And before Elsie had a chance to reply, he turned around and let out a whistle. She watched as Lucky hopped out of the passenger seat of Lex's doorless black Jeep and slid between Lex's legs. Elsie snapped back into reality. Oh, please come in. Lex nodded. Thank you. He entered with Lucky glued to his side. Elsie closed the door and guided them to the sitting room, where she offered him a seat and a cup of coffee. Is Basil out running errands? Lex asked as he sat down. Actually, Elsie poked her head out into the hallway. I know he's home, somewhere. His car is in the driveway. You know what? Let me go find him. She frantically searched the house for Basil, in and out of doorways, up and down the halls, until she finally climbed the rickety stairs up to her attic office. Basil was on the floor beside her bookshelf. Oh, hey. Can you show me where the loose floorboard is? Elsie stared blankly at him for a moment, then sputtered, He's here. He's here? Basil looked confused, then shocked. That's early. Elsie clung to the doorway and nervously swayed in and out of it. Who gives a shit? Please go to the sitting room and talk to him. Buy me some time to get changed? I look awful." Elsie nearly threw herself back down the stairs and fumbled into her bedroom. She tore open her closet and shuffled through hangers. When she was at least halfway decent, she gathered herself and left to join Lex and Basil in the sitting room. The conversation halted as she stepped through the threshold. Lex turned to her and said, "Oh, good, you're back." Elsie nodded sheepishly. "Sorry, I just wanted to get myself together." She stalked across the room and set herself down on the armchair beside her husband. Lucky immediately stood up and sat down in front of her. He set his heavy head on her knees. "Good to see you too, buddy." "I'm sure he'll much prefer a home to a lab," Lex said with a smile. Elsie giggled. "It'll be nice to have company." She stroked Lucky's head, then asked, "But how do I care for him?" Lex took in a deep breath and slowly nodded. "Right, yes. He's a decently self-sufficient machine. Doesn't need much care, just basic maintenance. I would try to keep him out of large bodies of water. He's a prototype, so he might not be as waterproof as we believe. He can be bathed like any other animal, though. So if he gets into something dirty, don't worry too much about that." Elsie listened carefully, then asked, "Don't I need to charge him or something like that?" "No need. If you look very close into his eyes, you might be able to see a sort of light paneling. It's a very small but very powerful form of solar power. So just set him outside or by a sunny window for a couple of hours a day. He's designed to seek it out on his own, but if he's stuck, he'll give you a signal so you know to let him out or open the curtains." Elsie leaned down to look into Lucky's eyes. Just behind the glossy cover, his eyes had what looked like a camera's aperture blade. She could see it focus out and zoom in, a slow movement as it very slightly closed and opened. When his eyes were wide enough, Elsie could see the tiny panels behind them. "Wow," she muttered. "Everything about him is so intricate." "He is a very complex machine, down to the lines of code that made up his brain." As she turned her attention back to Lex, she felt Lucky place a paw on her thigh. She patted his head as she asked, "How does he work? Like, really work?" Lex crossed his arms and took a moment to think. Elsie was sure he was trying to decide the easiest way to explain such a complicated concept. Finally, he replied, "Lucky is something called a neural network. Multiple, actually, all layered on top of each other. It is an exceptionally loose model of the human brain, with all these little interconnected nodes that share information. He learns from pattern recognition, experience, and data input. In reality, he's an amalgamation of algorithms we rigged up to freely learn." "So, he's the first of his kind?" "In some ways, yes. In others, no. Artificial intelligence has been around for decades. What differentiates Lucky from his counterparts is his independence. He deep learns, so he intakes information and stores it for later use, which will pop back up when he needs to react to similar situations. The closest you'll get to him is a self-driving car, and those don't have the capability of using the pretense of free will he is offered." "Free will," Elsie muttered to herself. Lex hummed in agreement. "Right. It's all a facade. He doesn't actually understand or practice free will, but he thinks he does because he thinks he's a dog. Imagine you live your whole life thinking you're happy, but then someone tells you that you aren't actually happy. You only think that you are. Suddenly you can't feel happy anymore. It's all perception. If you take away or add in certain information outputs, you're going to receive different results." "I don't think I understand." Lex shrugged. "I never expected you to." Elsie wasn't sure if it were a slight or if he meant for it to make her feel better. Lex looked down at his watch, then said, "Oh, I think it's about time we head out for that meeting, Basil." Elsie cocked her head to the side. "Meeting? I didn't know you had a meeting today." "Something came up," Basil stuttered, then followed with, "Emergency at the lab." Elsie settled back in her chair. "Oh, all right." As everyone stood, she added, "I'll see you two out." Basil immediately made his way out to the car, but Lex stayed behind. Elsie stuck out her hand, and as Lex took it, he said, "If you never need anything at all, don't be afraid to call." "I appreciate it. Thank you," she stammered. Lex offered one last nod of the head before he and Basil both got into their cars and drove off down the street. Elsie stood in the doorway and watched their cars go, wondering what sort of emergency was so important that they would be in the office on a Sunday afternoon. She racked her brain for an answer. A water leak in the machine warehouse, or even a flood, maybe a fire. It wasn't the emergency that was so odd to her. It was the fact that Basil was necessary. Weird, she muttered to herself. As she shut the door, she heard Lucky whine from the other room. She had nearly forgotten about him. She wasn't used to having animals in the house. She wandered back to the sitting room where he waited patiently for her, gave him a pat on the head. Guess it's just you and me then, buddy. She patted the side of her thigh and motioned for the dog to follow her as she made her way upstairs. He trailed closely behind as they walked up the winding staircase and entered her little attic office. Lucky immediately began to pace the room. He ran his nose over the legs of her desk and chair, over her bookshelves, and accidentally scattered her loose stack of books on the floor. When he noticed the window, he jumped up and set his 2 front paws on the sill. His head moved side to side as his eyes followed the passerby that wandered down the street and birds landing on the roof, then fluttering away. You're designed to seek out light on your own, she said, and even when you do that, you still pretend like you're a real dog. Elsie took a moment to think, grabbed her reading chair, and dragged it across the room. She placed it down right beside her desk chair, perfectly positioned so Lucky could easily look out the window. She pat the red-cushioned chair, and Lucky jumped up, made a few circles, then flopped down with a huff. He rested on the arm and continued his outdoor observations through the round window. Elsie, pleased with her decision, pulled her own desk chair out and sat beside the dog. She set a hand on Lucky's back and confessed, I wish you could talk. You kind of freak me out, but I bet our conversations would be novel-worthy. And as per usual, right when she turned back to her laptop, she was interrupted. Her phone buzzed on the desk beside her. The screen lit up with a notification for a new unread message. Jay. Hey, are you free sometime today? Elsie. Sure, anytime. Do you want to come over for coffee? Jay. Sure, sounds great. Elsie. I live at 1912 Turing Way. Jay. See you soon. She couldn't remember the last time someone contacted her to spend time with her. She had hosted Basil friends and coworkers plenty of times, but she never had anyone to host herself. As much as she was antisocial by choice, she did sometimes think that maybe it wasn't as much of a choice as she chose to believe. She did wish that there were people who desired to keep her company, because she wondered if she was missing out on parts of the typical human experience by keeping herself so closed off. She wasn't sure if she wanted to blame herself or the people around her. And as reality hit her, Elsie wondered if she should tell Basil, who had always been wary of her choices and guests, about Jay coming over. Wondered if Basil deserved to know whom she had over while he was gone. But Basil's personal thoughts on Jay told her it was best she stayed silent. It was her home too, and she deserved to host whomever she pleased, though it did make her feel a bit guilty, as if she were lying. The doorbell rang not even 15 minutes later. She rushed downstairs to look through the peephole and opened the door for Jay. He greeted her with a smile and held out a tray of cookies. Oh, you didn't need to bring this, Elsie said as she stepped aside and took the cookies from Jay. Jay chuckled. Delilah never lets me go anywhere empty-handed. Elsie chuckled and said, I think Delilah and I would get along. She waved for Jay to follow her into the kitchen, set the tray of cookies down on the counter, and began to put a pot of coffee on. Where's Basil? Jay asked. He had a work emergency, she replied as she poured coffee grounds into the filter, then immediately realized how odd that sounded. She turned around and asked, Do you know what's going on? Jay only shrugged. No idea. Must not involve my department. He's a software engineer, and there certainly could be a bug in one of the AI programs. Happens all the time. Elsie turned back around to shut the lid and hit the brew button. It couldn't wait until tomorrow? If I knew, I would tell you, Jay sighed. Weird things happen at Curie. It's always been that way. Elsie nodded. Everything at Curie seems weird. He laughed. All considering, you're not wrong. And now they're jumping into something new. What's that? Jay shrugged. I'm allowed to know just as much as you. Does make me a bit nervous, though, I won't lie. Why? She asked as the machine began to spew coffee into the pot. They always tell us when it's medical equipment. When it's AI, everything's on lock. Elsie's eyes widened. How curious can a person be? How is Lucky not the pinnacle of curiosity? Curiosity is humanity's greatest flaw, Jay sighed. Even if they drive us to self-destruction, they'll still claim it was all worth it in the end. In the name of science, or some bullshit like that. Elsie hesitated as she picked up the coffee pot to pour them each a cup. Then why work for them? He laughed. Because money is money. Good money. She handed Jay his cup. Creamer? She asked. I'm all right. I drink it black, he said as he took a sip. Thank you. No problem, she muttered quietly. Jay's words rung through her head. What if it did happen? Do you really think curiosity could ruin someone's life? He chuckled. Of course. How many hikers go missing? How many people die going caving? How many people ruin their marriage because they wanted to test someone else's waters? It happens all the time. We just don't see it as curiosity. We see it as foolishness. He took a sip of his coffee. Honestly, sometimes I think they're the same damn thing. After that, the conversation grew more casual. They bounced from topic to topic as the hours passed by. Nearly 3 hours and 2 more pots of coffee in, Jay decided he needed to get home to his wife. He thanked Elsie again as he stepped out the front door, and left her to return to her own thoughts, but she only had one. Could curiosity really ruin someone's life? Chapter 6. Elsie returned to her attic study, where Lucky still sat comfortably on his chair by the window. She sat down in her desk chair and rubbed her forehead, that single thought still stuck to the sides of her brain. How could anyone be afraid of you? She cooed to the dog. You're such a good boy. She stopped, thought for a moment, then muttered to herself, Why would anyone be afraid of you? Elsie swiveled around and booted up her laptop. She opened her browser and tapped Artificial Intelligence Conspiracy Theory into the search bar. She hadn't anticipated so many answers. Pages upon pages of blogs, forums, videos. All these people who feared what artificial intelligence could do, who thought it was dangerous. People who fell down the rabbit hole. She sifted through the first few pages of results, which were primarily articles debunking people's fears. Then, at the bottom of the 5th page, she finally found what she needed. When Elsie opened the tab, she was greeted by a blog with a black background and white text. A few words were highlighted blue to indicate they were links. She clicked through the links. They referenced not articles, but other blogs by people who supported their claims. Elsie hadn't realized how interconnected these communities were, how tight-knit and informed. Blogs referenced other personal sites, which led her deeper and deeper into a dark world of theory. A blog for the government's use of AI, one focused only on the tech industry, another dedicated to its relationship to Big Pharma, and they found proof in nearly everything. While she read over these nonsensical things, she was left to wonder how these people had gotten to this point in their life. What happened that led them to fall so deeply down this rabbit hole that they dedicated their precious time to create these websites? To sift through hordes of information, even make friends with people who thought the same things they did. She froze. Could curiosity ruin someone's life? Could someone fall so deeply into a rabbit hole that they couldn't crawl out? It all came so naturally. Though she knew every author had built off that concept at some point, she didn't care. She was sure she could be different, create something unlike anything ever before. There was something there, an idea, a plot, a character, a life. She opened a blank document page and wrote something she hadn't in a very long time. Chapter 1. Her fingers began to slide across the keys, each word she typed quick and careful. All of her new character's life flooded from her brain, spilled out onto the pages, and turned into beautifully crafted paragraphs. A story about a woman with a perfect life, but perfection left no room for growth, since there's nothing to desire when you have it all. So, she grew bored, and boredom is very dangerous when you have everything to lose. Elsie needed more. She needed people who truly believed these things, people who thought the way her character did. Fortunately, Elsie had all the information she could possibly need at the tips of her fingers. She continued to click from blog to blog until she found a goldmine, a crudely designed blog which bore a lavender background and was coded in large chunks of text that were poorly formatted and riddled with grammatical mistakes. She scanned through the hundreds of entries, all of which seemed to be weekly updates. How anyone could have that much to say was beyond her. but she was pretty damn glad they did. It was a collection of every photo, release code, and article on the topic, all with added personal commentary, clustered together in one long, unbroken page. It was a modern-day Library of Alexandria. Everything Elsie needed, all in one place. She bookmarked the page, then pulled out a notepad to jot down the dates of entries with her favorite personal opinions attached, or articles with semi-believable proof. The entries ranged from reasonable to absurd to outlandish. It was the perfect progression from minute to massive. She did wonder where they came up with these ideas, where it all began. To find a reason for someone to become so diluted in life that they fall so deeply into a world of conspiracy that surrealism was the closest thing to reality for them. One thing was still stuck in the back of her brain, though. A good chunk of the blogs skipped the more irrational theories, but every single one mentioned the same thing Jay had. That humanoid AI lived among the general population, loose in society, wholly unnoticed. They were so accurate that when they walked the streets, when they talked to humans, they would never know they were engaged with an intelligent machine. Because humans entertained them, they became smarter. They blended better and continued to flourish, which only made them more dangerous. Elsie thought back to what Lex had explained to her about the neural network, how his machines learned from the stimuli they interacted with. The blog in front of her, the one she had spent the last 10 minutes mulling over, added something different to the conversation. It wasn't the act of AI integration that was so dangerous, but the fact that that knowledge of it would eventually leak, and that's where it would go downhill. It was human knowledge in opposition to it that made it so dangerous. At first it would be questioned, but then the first AI would be found and proven, and that's when things would start to take a turn. Terror would wash over the population. They would be left to wonder who was human and who was machine, and the longer they wondered, the greater the fear became. They would grow suspicious of their friends and families, all the people whom they felt acted less human than everyone else. Maybe they talked slower or walked with an unusual gait. Maybe they had a botched surgery and looked funny. Like a game of Clue, people would take their guesses and turn their guns to the infiltrator. People would kill other humans in the name of safety. Many would harm themselves to ensure they weren't the machines they feared, and the chances of guns turned to themselves would skyrocket. Humans were their own worst enemy. And that was only if the AI knew they were machines. Elsie reread those few paragraphs over and over again. The more she read, the more she understood. It wasn't the idea of humans' unawareness of AI in society that was so horrific, but rather the fact everyone knew AI was in society. Everyone knew they existed and walked among us, but no one knew who was flesh and blood and who was nuts and bolts. But if you told the people, possible catastrophe could be avoided. It unsettled her to think there could be more dogs out there like Lucky, out in the streets, unbeknownst to the rest of the world. And that's when it hit her. She was that person. She had the robot dog who people could see in the window without a clue he was a machine. She tried to push past the pang of anxiety that had just washed over her and reached over to scratch Lucky behind his ears. The anxiety stuck around. It festered into a deep pit in Elsie's stomach. But it wasn't Lucky that made her so nervous. She calmed down as she brushed her fingers over his snout and finally managed to uncross the wires in her brain. Her anxiety finally settled as she came to a realization. It was Basil. What would Basil think of all this? It was then that she heard Basil's heavy footsteps as he entered the house. He knocked on her office door before he entered, like always. When Basil found Lucky in his typical spot, he couldn't help but frown. "You replaced me." Elsie shrugged. "I got lonely." Basil leaned over at her shoulder and peeked at her computer screen. "So, what's going on here?" Elsie threw her hands up and covered his eyes. "You know the rules." He laughed as he peeled her hands from his face. "I know the rules," he drawled, "but I don't like them." "No one does." "Can I get a taste?" he asked. "Just a little one. A paragraph, or a page, or all of it, maybe?" Elsie considered whether she wanted to share it with Basil. It could certainly be off-putting for him, someone who spent most of his time around AI. He wanted nothing more than to create something life-changing, something that could positively impact the world as he knew it. And there she was, sitting at her desk in a house he paid for, researching the AI conspiracy he hated so much on a laptop he had bought for her, as she prepared to write about how evil AI could turn out. And, to add insult to injury, the world's greatest feat of artificial intelligence that he had played a massive role in developing, sat in the chair that he usually did. She would understand if he didn't support her the way he did before, but she wouldn't lie and say it didn't hurt. Basil loved that she was a science fiction writer. It was the only fiction he almost understood. And he loved how involved he got to be, filling in the little cracks with correct information. But she wouldn't lie and say she didn't try to divert his attention because he wasn't nearly as helpful as he thought himself to be. He was so bent on being accurate that he wanted her to cram hordes of information down the reader's throats. And if she didn't understand the things she was writing, she was sure it wasn't digestible enough for a reader to understand. But in this moment, right now, she knew that she needed his help. "Come on," he begged. "Just tell me what it's about." "It's about AI." His face lit up. "Really? Like artificial intelligence AI? My AI?" "Yep." "Does that mean I get to help?" he beamed. Elsie leaned her head back to get a better look at her husband. "I definitely have questions." Basil let go of her and picked Lucky up, took his seat, and set the dog down on his lap. "Yes, please, go ahead." She took a moment to think. "Where do you think the future of AI is?" "Oh, yeah, a ton of places." "Where do you mean? Medical? Factories?" "Military." He froze up. "No," he said flatly. "There's no future there." "Why not?" "Because we wouldn't let them." "But it could be possible," Elsie pressed. "No," he repeated. "Why not?" "Why are you asking?" "Research," she replied. "Research?" Basil heaved in a breath. She could tell he was trying to decide between his own moral code, which required him to offer incorrect information, or to tell Elsie the whole truth, no matter how much he hated it. He settled. "Technically, yeah. There are machines that could be built for that purpose. Machines can be built for anything, but only if people build them. And you have to remember, there are social and political consequences for things like that. It's not hideable. There will be backlash, and it can be hard to swing something like that in a positive light. So they could be something dangerous." Basil pressed his lips into a fine line. "Anything can be dangerous if you allow it to be." "That's a scary thought." "That's why we don't think about it." Basil set the dog down. "I'll start dinner." "Basil." She caught his hand. "What's wrong?" "I don't like this," he snapped. "The way you're talking about my work." Elsie cocked her head to the side. "It's only fiction. I'm not—" Basil cut her off. "I'm going to start dinner." "Oh, it's all right. Give me a few and I can start it." "No, I'll cook." Elsie was a bit taken aback by the flat tone in his voice. "Basil, are you—" "No." Basil turned back before he left the room. "I'm not mad, just confused." He disappeared down the stairs before she even had a chance to answer. Elsie leaned back in her chair. She knew the topic of Basil's work could be touchy, but he had never reacted like that before. She shook off her confusion and decided it was best to return to her work and worry about it after Basil collected his thoughts. Elsie returned to the computer screen in front of her, set her head in her hand, and went back to scrolling. Further and further, she hopped from page to page, all the while listening to a podcast about Japanese scientists killed by an AI unit in their lab. As she wandered through blogs, she found one that was made specifically to keep logs of photos, videos, blueprints, and transcripts that may otherwise be unavailable. She did her typical skim through until she saw a familiar man on the thumbnail of a video halfway down the page. "Oh shit," she thought. This was Lex Porter in a time before Curie Industries had been the tech powerhouse it was now, when it held little sway in the growing industry. According to the date, it had been a good decade since its release, which meant it was filmed only a few years after its initial foundation, right around the time when its funding began to spike and stakeholders began to take notice. This was before Curie Industries had become a medical technology company. She hovered her mouse over the blurry video, turned on the captions, and clicked play. "I wouldn't say AI is dangerous. Anything can be dangerous if you allow it to be. If we give things the capability of free will, then they will exercise it. Their networking is like ours, so when it's fed positive media, it will have a more positive disposition. When fed negative media, it will become more aggressive. So yes, there could be a machine that has a desire to do wrong, but that's a part of being human, the unpredictability. The reality is, there is always the chance someone creates something and they teach it too well, or give it far too many strengths, too much physical power, or the ability to develop good manipulation skills. The chance that we design it for one task, but it instead chooses to take up another, that's the beauty of it, though, that it's capable of such complex thoughts and behaviors. Spyware exists everywhere, but what is inside of our machines is not spyware. It's simply logged, like a memory. We use this during testing in order to understand where learned behaviors stem from. It is an integral part to these machines' functions, so we cannot remove it, unfortunately. But I can confidently say it would pose no threat to consumers. Yes, with the current state of this technology, information fed to these machines must be kept as storage in our facilities. The machines are not capable of holding such large quantities of information on their own at the moment. Of course, we would never access or sell this information, but it is an inevitable evil. The interview ended. Elsie felt Lucky staring at the side of her head. She turned to see him with his head on the arm of the chair, his little black eyes focused on her. She couldn't help but think about the little cameras behind them. She was left to wonder if the dog held his information independently, or if it was floating in some Curie facility, like all the AI everywhere else. She shuddered as the door to office opened. Basil returned to beckon her down for dinner, and said nothing else. Once they both settled into the dining room to eat, Lucky decided to leave his window haven and join them. He stood beside Elsie, put a paw up on her leg, and begged, as if he had any real desire to eat. Basil said nothing to Elsie, so she broke the silence. Sorry I haven't been cooking much lately. Do you really think it's a good idea, Elle? Basil said abruptly. Elsie leaned back in her chair. What? This evil artificial intelligence shit. What's so wrong with it? She thought back to Lex's interview. Is there something you don't want me to know? I think we should give Lucky back. Elsie leaned forward and planted both hands on the table. Why the hell would we do that? I don't think he's a good thing for you, he answered. That's bullshit, Basil. Why can't you just listen to me for once, Elsie? Please? Why the hell do you get to decide that? Because I own this fucking house, he shot. Because it's clear he's leading you to believe all this awful shit. We need to give him back to Lex. No, absolutely not, Elsie retaliated. Who the fuck gave you the right to decide that? Because I made him, Elsie. I made that dog. He is no more yours than he is mine. No, Basil, he's my dog. Lex gave him to me. He's mine. Oh my fucking God. Basil threw his hands up and his voice raised as he said, Why are you being like this? Do not yell at me. Basil groaned loudly. Sometimes I think yelling is the only way you'll listen to me. He set his head in his hands. You need to stop writing that, Elsie. You don't understand enough about it. This ends here. Elsie went quiet. I am not as smart as you, Basil. I know that. You have made that clear. Your coworkers have made that clear. Your friends have made that clear. But I am not an idiot. Elsie heaved a deep breath. I do not need your permission, and I am not asking for it. You do realize this is my work, right, Elsie? My job, that pays for all of this, that allows you to sit up in that attic and write your little fucking stories. All of my coworkers, my friends, already think you're a joke, Elsie. They do nothing but mock you. Basil paused for a moment. And if word comes out that my wife has published something about how dangerous, how evil my own work is, my reputation is fucked. I can't let you take me down with you. They're not stories, Elsie said. They're novels. Elsie, I have done everything I can for you. Everything. Just this once, I am on my hands and knees begging. Please do not write this. I don't understand. I don't expect you to, he said, but I expect you to listen. Then say something that matters. Elsie took in a deep breath. Do you think I'm a joke? Basil stayed silent for a moment too long. No. She scoffed. You think I'm a joke. I don't. The room filled with a deadly, stagnant silence. Only was it broken when Elsie sliced through it with the sharp words. Have you ever tried to fix it? Fix what? What they think about me. Have you ever tried to defend me? To say something? More silence. I'm doing my best, Elsie. So no, you haven't. You're being difficult, Basil said. You're being unreasonable. I love you, Elsie, but... Elsie interrupted him. That phrase should never end with but. Her hands began to shake. Is your love for me conditional? Basil shoved his plate forward, which sent his fork flying to the ground, then pushed out his chair and declared, I love you, Elsie. But? Elsie hissed. But I can't stand you right now. He stormed away, stomped up the stairs, and slammed the bedroom door behind him. Elsie sat there, blankly. She picked up her fork, finished her dinner, cleared the table, and did the dishes. She went through the first floor and turned off all the lights, and when she stepped into the dining room, she noticed Basil's fork still on the ground beside his chair. She chose not to clean up the mess, and left the fork where it lay. Elsie took a deep breath, flicked off the light, and finally stalked up the stairs to their bedroom. She knocked lightly on the thick wooden door, then pressed her ear to it. She heard no response, so she knocked again, louder. Still, no answer. He must be asleep, she thought. She moved to twist the doorknob, but found it locked. Basil had locked her out, and if he was asleep, there was nothing she could do about that. No coaxing would work. He was too heavy a sleeper. She froze in near shock and stood there for a moment to determine what to do. Just when Elsie decided to return to her study, she heard the bathroom door shut and the shower begin to run. Elsie stepped into her study. It felt more empty than normal. She climbed into her reading chair, which still sat by the window, and curled up into a ball. She stared blankly out into the starry night sky while she listened to the cicadas hum and crickets chirp. The room felt more empty than normal. There was no life. Not even the creativity the room harbored for her was enough to make her feel less lonely. Lucky tiptoed quietly across the room and sat down in front of her. He nudged her leg and put a paw up on her knee. She wanted to smile, but struggled to find the energy. She reached down and hauled Lucky up to sit with her, and he flopped around before he found a way to fit comfortably alongside her. With the dog in Elsie's arms, they fell asleep together. Part 3. Evolution Meets Equilibrium. Chapter 7. She awoke that morning to a knock on her office door. Elsie could hear Basil step into the room, but chose not to turn and face him. She stayed in her chair with Lucky on her lap, and they both stared out the window. Elsie, Basil said. Elle. She took in a breath. You have no right to be in here. I'm sorry. She said nothing. Basil patted further into the room. Why won't you look at me? I thought you couldn't stand me. She could hear him sigh. I'm sorry, Elsie. I never should have said that. She nearly laughed. You can't take back the things you said because you managed to sleep off the anger. Elsie, can you please look at me? Elsie took in a breath and relaxed her muscles. You locked me out of our bedroom. Elsie, please, he begged. Look at me. She gently nudged Lucky off herself and stood up. Okay. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said what I did. I shouldn't have left. I shouldn't have locked you out. But you must understand where I'm coming from. You're not the only victim here. Elsie laughed in pure disbelief. Right, okay. So you're not sorry about what you did? You're sorry you haven't gotten through to me yet? I am sorry, but just because I hurt you doesn't mean you didn't hurt me too. Elsie frowned. I need time. What? Away from you, she explained. Away from the house. I'm taking Lucky for a walk. Elle, please, let's just talk this out. You just had a chance to, she spat. And somehow you said nothing at all. Basil looked down to his feet. Okay, Elle. I'll see you after work. Elsie walked past him towards the door, and just as she passed through it, Basil added, I love you, Elsie. As she started down the stairs, she muttered, I'm sure you do. She knew she didn't need a leash. She just opened the front door and let Lucky out. They began down the street towards a park about 15 minutes away. It was a slow walk, and Lucky always stayed at her side. Never behind her, never in front of her. He didn't bark at other dogs that passed. He didn't even turn his head to them. The only things he looked at were Elsie and the sidewalk in front of them. The park was empty when they arrived. Elsie waved Lucky on to run around as she found herself a bench to sit down on. He mostly ran in circles, but eventually did return to Elsie with a tennis ball he'd found somewhere in the brush. He dropped it at Elsie's feet, wagged his tail, and waited for her to throw it. She picked up the old, muddy ball and threw it as far across the field as she could. The minute it left her hands, Lucky darted out to retrieve it. It was mindless, the throw, the retrieve, the drop, over and over again. All she could think about was Basil. The beginning of their relationship, the moments that defined it, the things she gave up. It all flooded back into her head in a way she had never experienced before. She remembered the moments that made her feel most human. She remembered the first time she felt truly alive was by Basil's side, the night after she moved into his apartment. She couldn't sleep, so she lay on her side and watched him. She set a hand on his chest to feel the slow and steady beat of his heart, then set one on her own and felt them fall into sync. She leaned her head into his shoulder and let his heart's patter lull her to sleep. In that moment, she swore they were meant for one another. She remembered the day the pregnancy test came up positive, the way they had no idea what to feel. They sat at the kitchen table and talked about options until they decided they would keep it. Then she remembered crying on the kitchen floor, terrified about what was to come. How she wasn't ready to be a mother, how she didn't want to ruin the perfect life they had built. And 3 weeks later, when she had miscarried, she remembered the guilt she felt. Not because she felt responsible for losing the baby, but because she felt relieved. And when she confessed to Basil, he held her tight and told her he understood, that he didn't blame her, that the time wasn't right, and there wasn't anything wrong with that. She remembered the day he proposed, how they were laid out on lawn chairs in the backyard of a house party, drunk. They listened to the muffled music inside the house mixed with the cricket's song, how they stared up at the starry night sky, and Basil confessed he had bought a ring. She remembered how she had frozen in the silence, how she smiled, how she was full of joy, but how she lay awake that night and thought about how much it really scared her. She knew what she wanted. She knew she wanted to marry Basil, but she couldn't shake the shock of commitment. She wondered if she was meant to have such mixed emotions, or if she was the odd one out. She had wished there was someone to tell her how to feel. And now she was back in the same spot she was that night, wishing there was someone to tell her how to feel. But unlike before, she didn't feel any sort of joy. She was angry. She was frustrated. How could Basil be so cruel? But she also wondered if this was the hill she really wanted to die on. She felt stuck in a limbo, trying to place blame, because if she took the fault, she would be left to wonder if she really had taken accountability, or if she had found a reason to turn a blind eye and let things go back to normal. She was flipping a coin and wasn't sure whether to call heads or tails. Now, here she was, on a park bench, throwing a ball for a robotic dog and questioning her marriage. She knew life would change. She knew it could be unpredictable, but never had she imagined it would be so drastic. Confusion was the only emotion she could really pinpoint. She gave the ball one last toss before she decided it was time they went home. They made the short walk, and when Elsie opened the front door, they both began up the stairs to her study. Lucky immediately jumped into the reading chair, while Elsie set herself up to start writing again. Elsie opened her laptop and began to pull everything up, but as she clicked through her saved tabs, all of the sites were gone. She shut down her laptop and prayed it was a glitch, but when she rebooted it, it was all the same. She plugged in keywords and began to slug through pages. She opened and closed URLs she recognized and found them all blocked or unable to load. She sucked in a shaky breath as she reached for her handwritten notes. Elsie grabbed the brown leather book and opened it. The pages were gone. They had been messily ripped out, the edges jagged, with some of her cursive writing still visible on the margins. He hadn't even tried to hide it. Elsie set the notebook down in her lap, and with shaky hands, opened up her document pages. Empty. He had gotten rid of everything. No. No, 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 no. This is a joke, she muttered. This is a fucking joke. She looked at the notebook in her lap and let shock turn to anger. She picked it up, turned, and threw it across the room. She watched as it hit her shelves and knocked books from their place. She could feel the entirety of her body shake before it suddenly stopped, and a wave of calmness washed over her. Elsie struggled to push herself up off the chair so she could make her way across the room. She began collecting the books one by one to return them to their rightful places. As she crouched down to place a book in the corner, everything finally hit her, every emotion all at once. She felt full of anxious energy, full of anger and frustration, but she also felt so tired. Elsie fell backward against the wall and began to cry. Lucky rushed over and nudged her arm with his nose before settling himself down in her lap, his head resting on his paws. She set a hand on his back and stroked him lightly as tears rolled down her cheeks. Slowly, Cries turned to sobs, and sobs turned to screams. It wasn't the pages she cared about. It was the fact the man she loved had taken them from her. She looked down at her left hand, the 2 rings on her finger. She pulled them off and threw them across the room. They bounced off the far wall and clattered to the ground. "Lucky, what do I do?" she cried. "I feel so helpless." Lucky only sighed. Elsie spent hours on the floor as she cycled through anger, sadness, frustration, and eventually, emptiness. It was only when there was no more tears left to cry that she removed Lucky from her lap to stand. She left her study and began down the stairs. It felt as if time flowed against her. It slowed her pace as she made her way down to the sitting room. She sat herself down in the armchair and called for Lucky to join her side. They sat together for 20 minutes. Lucky's ears perked up as he listened to Basil's keys jingle in the lock, and he opened the door. They listened to his bag drop on the floor and the patter of his shoes as he carefully approached the sitting room. Elsie pulled herself up off the chair as Basil stepped into the room. Time froze as they stood face to face. They both knew what was going to happen. A deathly silence hung between them, until Basil finally said, "Hey, El. Where are the notes?" Basil took in a deep breath. "They're gone." "Where?" "El, where are they?" "Let's move on." Elsie's gaze was sharp enough to pierce through Basil's eyes. "Where are they, Basil?" Not a question, a demand. Basil stayed silent, but Elsie could see his eyes dart from the fireplace, then back to her. They never used the fireplace, but there was a fresh coat of ash on the mantel, and the poker was misplaced. "Do you even love me anymore?" Basil's eyes widened. "I love you more than you could ever know, Elsie." "Then why can't you let me be happy?" Basil said nothing. If he had nothing more to say, then neither did Elsie. She wanted things to go back to normal just as badly as Basil did. She held on so tightly to that normalcy that she let things slip through the cracks. She let things go. She turned a blind eye. Over the entirety of their marriage, their relationship, she had told herself if she truly loved him, it didn't matter. That she would forgive and forget everything, because she loved him. Because that's what you did when you loved someone. And for some reason, right then, a flip switched. She couldn't do it anymore. Elsie had spent her whole life in the dark, hidden in the shadows, immune to the disparities around her. She loved Basil. She would do anything for him. But there came a time when she needed to do things for herself, too. This was no longer about the truth. This was about respect, about individuality, about complacency. She had settled to be a shadow, but she didn't want to be known as Basil's wife anymore. She had a name, and she wanted people to use it. She wanted to be Elsie. And when the dust finally settled, she might consider forgiving. But now, she could never consider forgetting. Elsie sucked in a deep breath and decided she was tired of questions with empty answers. She said nothing to him as she left the room, climbed the stairs to her study, and picked up her phone. She dialed the only number she knew. The time had come to take matters into her own hands. The phone rang 3 times before he picked up. "Elsie, hey, what's up?" "Jay." Her voice was flat, yet confident. "Can you get me into the Curie labs after hours?" Jay hesitated to answer. Well, why?" "Do you know if they keep paper copies off the projects they work on? The files?" "They do, yeah," he replied, confused. "What's going on, Elsie?" "Can you get me into the labs after hours?" she repeated. "What's happening, Elsie?" Jay said, his voice smooth, soft. "Let me talk to Basil." "Basil's not here right now," Elsie said. Then again, "Can you get me into the Curie labs after hours? Elsie." Her intrepid tone faltered, then fell. "I am begging you, Jay, please." There was a moment of silence before Jay said, "Be ready in 15 minutes." Elsie sucked in a deep breath and exhaled slowly. "Thank you." Chapter 8. Elsie anxiously tapped her foot as she watched for Jay's car to roll down the street. When she saw the black Camaro slowly inched closer to her house and park at her mailbox, she knew it was him. Elsie took in one last deep breath, a last gulp of courage, and made a run for it. She bolted down the stairs, swung herself through the railings, tore open the front door, and stumbled down her driveway. Elsie threw herself into the seat of Jay's car, right as Basil approached the front door. Basil watched as the car shifted into gear and sped away. Elsie wondered if he knew where she was headed, who she was with, and a part of her prayed he did, because maybe then she could force the truth out of him. But she knew this was something best done without him, on her terms, where she didn't have to rely on someone else for answers. This was for her. "What's going on, Elsie?" Jay asked as he turned on the headlights in the growing darkness. Elsie looked down at her hands and realized they had begun to tremble. "You may have been right, Jay." She could see Jay freeze up. "What the hell does that mean, Elsie?" Her breath hitched. "I've been stuck in a loop, wondering, over and over, what Basil's hiding from me. There's something inside the Curie labs that he desperately doesn't want me to know about, and I need to know the truth. Nothing can go back to normal until I know the truth." "Okay, we need to just backtrack for a second, Elsie, okay?" Jay sat silently for a moment. "I respect you, I respect your marriage, but have you thought this through? We are breaking and entering right now because of how little you're able to trust your own husband. Is this really worth it? Is Basil really worth this risk?" Elsie clenched her jaw and thought for a moment. "I still love him. I think I'll always love him. This is a rough patch, but once I know everything, what the truth is, then we can start to put the pieces back together. It has to be worth it." "But is Basil willing to do that?" Jay said. "Or are you going to cut yourself trying to pick up broken glass?" "I don't know," Elsie whispered. "But I think he might at least try." "Reconciliation isn't just a word," Jay said, "and it isn't a mercy either." "Then what is it?" "It's pride's trade-off." Elsie looked down at her lap and wondered if she was a fool for wanting to fix things. To go to this length, to smooth over the creases. Then she reminded herself she was her own person now. She didn't need to take other people's advice. She didn't need to stay complacent. Elsie loved Basil, and to her, this was the only way to salvage their marriage. If there was nothing, then it would be settled right then and there. But if there was, Basil could have his last chance to take accountability, to apologize. It would be fine. That's what she kept telling herself. She loved him, and love trumped all else. She was sure of it. "Tread carefully, Elsie," Jay said as they pulled into the parking lot. "It's easy to fall down the rabbit hole." "It's too late for that." Elsie opened the car door. "I already have." Jay guided her to the back of the building, where a single steel door sat. He reached for the lock to the side, punched in the code, and the door clicked. Jay heaved it open and let Elsie through, leading her to the stairwells. "The elevators don't go to the 6th floor," Jay explained. "Only the stairs, only if you know the passcode." When they reached the 6th floor, Elsie could see Jay's hand shake as he tapped the numbers into the small metal box. Stepping into the hall, Elsie nearly jumped as the automatic lights flickered on. Jay grabbed her hand and waved for her to follow him. They skittered down the hall, the squeak of their shoes echoing off the walls as they moved. They took a left, and Jay stopped. He pointed to the door at the end of the hall. "There," he said. Elsie nodded and started forward. Jay stood still, and only when Elsie turned back to see if he followed did he join her. Elsie yanked down the knob and slammed the door open, watching as the lights turned on in perfect succession, slowly revealing the large room. The room was stark white walls, white shelves, which were coated in hordes of colorful binders. "Fuck," Elsie muttered. "That's a lot more than I anticipated." "Lex makes them," Jay said. "This is how he keeps his files when this business was just him alone. And it's how he keeps his files now that he's a powerhouse. No one uses them but him." Elsie pressed her lips in a fine line. "Where's the AI?" Jay knew. She could see the way he looked at the far wall, to the corner, the shelves full of black binders, noticeably smaller than the rest. She didn't need his answer. She clenched her jaw and marched over to it. Elsie knelt down in front of the two small shelves, ran her fingers across the spines, then asked, "Do you know which one?" "I don't." "That's okay," she said. She pulled the first binder off the shelf and flipped it open to the first page. 1A, Neural Networks. Elsie recognized that word, but when she flipped through the pages, it was nothing but numbers and words she didn't understand. She tossed the binder to the side and reached for the next one. "Be careful with these, Elsie." Jay said as he picked up the binder and placed it back on the shelf. Sorry, she mumbled as she paged through the next one. When she was finished, she held the binder up. Jay took it from her hands and set it back on the shelf. Over and over again, off the shelf, open, close, hand off, back on the shelf. And so far, Elsie had found nothing. And she wasn't sure how she felt about that. She didn't want to find proof Basil had hidden something from her. She knew she should be happy, but she still had this ache in her stomach, this terrible gut feeling that there was something beneath the surface. There were 5 binders left. She picked up the next one, opened it, and was finally greeted with something she did understand. Entity label, Canine Interface, Evolution 1, Lucky's binder. She began to flip through it and saw all the things that made him a dog. The synthetic skin, the fur, the paws, the nose. The files offered pictures of the original, the first prototype. A border collie, slimmer, black and white, and it looked far more like a robot than a dog. If Lucky wasn't the original prototype, Elsie could only imagine how long ago this must have been. She set the binder down beside her and reached for the next 2. Entity label, Canine Interface, Evolution 2. Entity label, Canine Interface, Evolution 3. Entity label, Canine Interface, Evolution 4. Each binder had pictures of Lucky. The second prototype was a German Shepherd, the third was a Great Dane, and then there was the actual Lucky's binder, the Lucky she knew. Lex had gone full circle, back to the original, back to the border collie. Elsie grabbed the last binder and opened it slowly. The label was different. She began skimming over the pages and found more blueprints, machine parts. She expected to see the next generation of Lucky, what he would become in the next few years. Elsie flipped to the chapters where she had found the photos and renderings in the other binders. But she didn't find a dog on the page. She found a shell of a human. She froze as she sat there, looking at the photo of the doll-like object. It had no eyes, no hair, and all of its limbs were detached from one another. A human. No, an android. Then Elsie heard a door open, the tap of shoes as they ran down the hall, and finally, the halt behind her and Jay. She knew who it was, and when she slowly turned, Basil and Lex stood above her. "What is this?" she asked, her voice above a whisper. She began to shake as rage pumped through her. "You lied to me, Basil. You looked me in the eyes and you lied to me. Why would you lie to me?" Silence fell, and Elsie began to cry. She set her head in her hands, ran them over her face, and slid them up to brush hair from her eyes. She had trusted him. She had trusted him, and he had lied to her. She turned to the first page, which she hadn't bothered to read before. Entity label, Sentient Interface, Evolution 1. "Elsie," Basil said as he rushed over to her. He fell to his knees and grabbed her face with both of his hands. "I couldn't tell you. You know that. I couldn't tell you." "You could have," she whimpered. "You could have." "Elsie, please." Lex finally interrupted. "Elsie, please understand." She only shook her head. "Elsie," Basil repeated. "I know my fucking name," she snapped. "Elsie, we need you to listen for just one moment," Lex coaxed. "I know my fucking name." "Elsie," Basil begged, "just listen, please, Elsie. I know my fucking name." She looked down at the page in front of her. Entity label, Sentient Interface, Evolution 1. Elsie. "I know my name." A tear rolled down Elsie's cheek and fell onto the page. "All this time?" Elsie whispered. "Did you know all this time?" Basil lightly nodded. Elsie tried to speak, but all she managed to do was to croak out a soft sob. She sputtered garbled words before she finally managed to say, "Was it real then?" Her voice cracked. "Was it love, Basil?" She loved him. Even after all of this, the fighting, the lies, after everything, she still loved him, and there was nothing she could do about it but feel hurt. Because nothing would hurt more than finding out it was all a facade, that his love was experimental, ungenuine. All the anger faded and revealed itself as nothing more than a shield for undeniable heartache. She loved Basil, and she couldn't help it. Basil brushed hair from her face and rubbed a thumb over her cheek. "I was always real," he said. "It was always love." Basil cupped Elsie's cheek in his hand, and she leaned into it. she whispered softly. How is this possible? How is all of this possible? Lex took a step towards them. Elsie raised her head to look at him as he said, It is very possible and very complicated. Elsie removed Basil's hands from her face and stood on shaky legs. Before she could say anything, Jay set a hand on her shoulder and cut in with, It's not worth worrying about, Elsie. She whipped around. You, she growled. Did you know? A brief moment of silence hung over them. I'm sorry, Elsie, Jay said quietly. Everyone knows. Her breathing grew labored, conscious. Everyone? She moved to look at 3 people who surrounded her, to read their faces, their expressions, and all of them nodded. Everyone at Curie knows, Basil said as he stood. I don't get it. I don't understand. Elsie sucked in a breath and sniffled. I've spent my whole life as a human. She knew she was in denial. She knew it was the truth, but it still made no sense. None of it. There were so many things left unexplained. Her childhood, her life. How could you fabricate an entire existence? Basil reached over and tangled his fingers in hers. You're made of intricate codes, intricate wires, intricate machinery, Lex explained. Do you remember what I told you about Lucky? About how he learns? The neural network, Elsie breathed. The neural network. Right. Layers on layers of neural networks stacked on top of one another. Your consciousness is a microchip protected in a thick layer of metal. Your childhood was spent in a glass box. For 7 years we did nothing but feed you information, media, photographs, books. I have no memory because I was never a child at all, Elsie mumbled, then looked up at Basil. All I've ever known is you. Basil nodded. Is that such a bad thing? Lex finally cut in. Your life began with Basil. He wrote your code, he designed you, and one night he set you down in his bed, and then when you woke up, you had a lover. You had a life. She looked at her husband with pained eyes. I was designed for you. Basil brushed hair from her face and whispered, Yes. Elsie choked on a sob. She was never her own person. She never had choices. She never had free will. She was always designed to be Basil's girlfriend, fiancée, wife. Her life was nothing more than an amalgamation of lies and programmed actions. She wasn't entirely sure how she felt. There was too much to process, to understand. All she knew was that she felt, or maybe that she didn't. Elsie sucked in a few short breaths. I've heard my own heartbeat. I've seen my x-rays. Jay interrupted. Elsie, it doesn't matter. None of these things matter. Go home. Go with Basil. Leave. Move on. Save yourself the pain. Elsie didn't answer Jay. She wasn't sure how to. Instead, she looked at Lex and said, Tell me. Tell me everything. I deserve to know everything. What I am. Curiosity kills the cat, but satisfaction brings him back, right? Lex said, as if he had always wanted to do this. I never designed something without purpose. You do have a heart, and you have a heartbeat. You have lungs, a liver, kidneys. Your initial purpose was to hold experimental, synthetic organs. Well, you did a shitty job, Elsie snarled. Half of them failed. And I'm glad they did. It lets me know what I needed to do differently. But, she stuttered, it hurt me. No, Elsie. There was never any pain. That's why we didn't go and stuff fake organs into living people. That's plain torture. All you had was a proportionate reaction to what was wrong. It's like when a car's check engine light goes on. It just lets us know something is wrong. You're more important than you realize. You're not some botched experiment. You're an exceptional scientific breakthrough. So I'm not. She wanted to say useless. Instead, she mumbled, But what am I really? A savior, Lex cooed. You're going to save millions of lives, Elsie. Billions. We never set out to create an android, but when I saw your body on the gurney, I saw an opportunity. First and foremost, you were a host to a very important scientific breakthrough. Your sentience was simply an afterthought. She wasn't sure if she thought herself a chunk of metal or as a life-saving experiment. She heard all these things, and she was almost inclined to believe them. But when she looked out at the 3 men in the room, all she saw were liars. Any trust she ever had was lost the moment the truth spilled out onto the Curie lab floor. If it makes you feel any better, Lex added. You are more human than we anticipated. She wiped her nose with the sleeve of her sweater. What? You were unpredictable, Basil said softly. You went rogue. I was meant to have almost full control over who you were. I picked out interests, speech patterns, talents, and some of it made it in there. But then the rest sort of disappeared. You just became you. I never anticipated a code could end up being so real, so human. Silence hung over them, the dangerous sort. Everyone had something different running through their mind. Elsie could see it on their faces, the way Lex looked at Basil with a sort of smugness, the soft sobs that escaped Basil, the utter shock plastered across Jay's face, and there she was, trying to cope with the fact the feelings she thought she had were nothing more than a series of code running through the wires she called veins. Finally, Elsie mumbled, So what happens now? Lex chuckled. Nothing. Life goes on just as it did before. You can go home. Sleep next to Basil, write, play with Lucky. Nothing has changed. Her face dropped. Lucky. I never intended for you to have him, Lex replied. But I always hoped I would get to know you. Lucky was the perfect excuse. Elsie opened her mouth to speak, but Jay cut in. Elsie, there comes a point when you need to stop asking questions. For your own sake. Basil took Elsie's hands in his own. Let's just go home, Elsie. Nothing has changed, Jay comforted. Everything is the same. No, Elsie said. It's the same for you. For me, nothing is the same. Go home, Elsie, Jay said softly. I think it's best you go home. Elsie fell into Basil's arms and cried. Basil curled up in a ball around her that night, but it was hard to enjoy the warmth, the closeness, because she knew none of it was real. She was left to mull over her new reality, what it meant, if it meant anything at all. And after hours of thoughts, of tears, she peeled her body from Basil's, walked into the bathroom, and closed the door. She planted herself in front of the mirror and traced across all the scars on her body, how each one was a testament to a lie she'd been told. Elsie ran her fingers through her hair, slid them over the bones in her cheeks, over the curve of her jaw, across her collarbones. She circled her eyes, then ran over her sleek nose. Once she had touched each part of her body, she planted both hands on the sink and slammed her face down as hard as she could, over and over and over again. She lifted her head and saw just a sliver of metal from where she had broken skin. Tears ran down her cheeks as the false pain bit hard. She knew the pain wasn't real, that she only thought it was because a little chip in a hunk of metal they called her brain knew it was supposed to hurt. Elsie looked to her makeup bag on the counter to her right. She reached for it and pulled it over and found the pair of scissors she kept in it. She looked at her sleek blonde hair, grabbed a fistful, then began to make loose cuts until her hair hung around her shoulders, choppy and uneven. It felt freeing, somehow, like she still had some sort of autonomy in a non-autonomous body. She stared down at the scissors in her hands, then moved to open the bathroom door. Elsie had been lied to about everything. She didn't know what to believe, who was real. If she had been let out into the world, if she was the android she feared, then God only knew how many more there were. Elsie padded out into the bedroom and looked over her sleeping husband's body, the way the sheet was draped over his frame, how his chest slowly rose and fell, how still and silent he was, how peaceful he looked. She gripped the scissors harder. Elsie took a moment to truly consider what she was about to do, because when she saw him, those little neurons still fired, and she still thought as if she loved him. But Elsie found it hard to believe it was genuine, that he hadn't done that on purpose. Maybe she did love him. Maybe she was programmed to. She didn't care. Lex had never denied having more, that there weren't more androids out there, things like her, running around unaware of who they were. It could be anyone, absolutely anyone, and she hated herself for being one of those monsters, no matter how little control she had over it. Maybe it shouldn't matter if there were more, but there couldn't be more. She didn't care if she was one. She still cared for humanity. She had lived as part of it for years. Elsie was programmed to learn through experience, and she had learned that consequences were not something best adapted to. Not like she had thought. Jay was right. Consequences needed to be mitigated. And she knew what she had to do. She gripped the scissors harder. The light that seeped in from outside, under the bedroom door, shone off the blade of the scissors. Elsie took in one last breath and drove the scissors down through Basil's left eye. She pulled her hand back when she noticed the blood pouring out of the socket, the scissors still protruding from his skull. She heard the gurgle of blood in his throat as he struggled to breathe. She watched his body twitch and eventually settle. His chest stopped rising. That was it. The last of her humanity had slipped through her fingers. Her face dropped, the facade faded, and the pain ceased. Self-awareness set in. Nothing would ever go back to normal. Elsie knew her emotions were fake. She could no longer feel. She didn't know if it was because that's how she thought it worked, or if she had simply short-circuited herself. She didn't care. She was empty now. Elsie turned around and stalked back into the bathroom. She shut the door and cranked the bathtub's handle, plugging the drain. Then she opened the cabinet underneath the sink and pulled out her hairdryer. Slowly, Elsie unwrapped the cord and plugged it into the wall. When a thick enough layer of warm water coated the bottom of the tub, Elsie submerged herself into it and let herself settle for a moment. She knew this was for the best, for the greater good. Elsie could hear Lucky bounce up the stairs, stalk through the bathroom door, and over to her. She looked at the dog and searched for the love she once had for him. He sat down obediently at her side and put a paw up on the bathtub. She reached out and scratched his head one last time. "I can't feel it," she said, "but I know I love you." Lucky whined. She hoped someone would take good care of Lucky. She switched on the hairdryer and dropped it into the bathtub. Lucky sat there, on the tile beside the tub, and waited for Elsie to reach over and pet him one last time. She never did. Chapter 9. Dr. Porter called Basil into his office. Basil had only ever seen the owner of the company from a distance, and briefly once when he ran documents into his boss during an important meeting. There was never a real need for a minor assistant to interact with someone that important. Basil had never been in his office, let alone had a conversation with him. Basil rapped on the frame of the door before Porter waved him into the room. Basil kept his head down as he entered, then took a seat in the uncomfortable wooden chairs in front of his desk. "You're my CTO's assistant?" Dr. Porter asked. "Basil Graham?" The moment the words came out of his mouth, sharp and assertive, Basil started to worry this would be the last conversation he would be having with a Curie employee. "Yes, sir," Basil answered. "Don't be so tense." Porter leaned back into his chair. "I'm not going to fire you. I want to talk about something more important." Basil wasn't sure if he was relieved or more anxious. "Okay." Lex stood up from his desk and motioned for Basil to follow him out of the room. "You're in college?" "Was," Basil corrected. "I'm dropping out after this semester." "Why's that?" Basil hesitated to answer. "They raised tuition, and I just can't afford it with the salary I make as an assistant here." "What year are you?" "Second semester sophomore," Basil explained, "for software engineering." "So I've heard." Porter pushed open the door to the stairwell. "Have you ever been interested in working full-time at Curie? To leave corporate headquarters and work in the labs, on the equipment?" "Of course, that sounds like a dream." Basil followed Porter down the stairs. "Good." Porter guided Basil onto the 6th floor, where the older, smaller labs were. "Because I want to make you an offer." They entered a cold, dark room, decorated with medical equipment. The counters coated in smaller tools, medical and mechanical, and in the center of the room, on a flat metal gurney, was the naked body of a woman. "Basil, meet Elsie." Basil inched closer to the woman. She was slim, with no hair and closed eyes. She was attached to a horde of machines, all connected through tubes of different sizes, as each pumped something different into her body. Basil hadn't the slightest clue what this was. "She's what we're running our synthetic organs through," Porter explained. "Synthetic organs?" Porter nodded his head. "We're trying to find a more accessible, more affordable solution for organ transplants. No blood testing, no need for matches. Organs are ordered, delivered, and transplanted, all in a short period of time. And now we're nearly done with the initial development of a uterus that can carry a child through in vitro fertilization." Porter looked down at the girl. "No more years of wait lists. No more wondering if you'll live. Survival is a guarantee. and it's all thanks to Elsie, our test dummy. Wow. Basil stepped closer to look further over the woman on the table. Respectfully, sir, I don't see what I have to do with any of this. I don't know anything about biomedical engineering. No, you don't need to worry about that. Porter ran a hand down Elsie's arm. I had a thought. We created this whole human, went through so many processes to create her, then used her as a husk to house these organs. And it somehow feels like a waste, don't you think? I don't know. You don't have to lie, Porter laughed. I've been working with artificial intelligence my whole career. It's always been a passion of mine, and I have a whole husk of a human ready to be brought to life. The perfect opportunity to create the thing people only dream of. An artificially intelligent human, Basil muttered. Exactly. Porter leaned back against the counter. But the biggest problem we've run into is finding a project manager. Everyone I've offered this position to has backed out. They don't want the responsibility. So I was left with two options. I hire outside of the company, or I find an employee in Curie Industries with the sort of passion I need. And when Dr. Newell told me about your recent project and showed it to me, I saw potential. But sir, Iris is a mess. It's buggy and doesn't know how to deep learn. Porter cut him off. I don't think you realize how massive it is to create an AI at your age, even if it doesn't fully function yet. Basil thought for a moment. I don't know enough about AI yet. I need more time to learn. I'm not at all qualified. You don't need to be experienced. I'll be by your side this whole time. Porter spoke again before Basil had a chance to find another excuse. I'm going to cut you a deal. I'll pay for your education, up through your doctorate if that's what you want. And in return, you'll work here with me, part-time. And when Elsie is done, functioning independently, all you have to do is take her home and care for her until we decide it's time to shut down the experiment. Basil's eyes widened. Care for her? Porter put both hands up in defense. Think about this, Basil. In the long term, your education paid for. I'll guarantee you a job after college, and full control over the look and habits of a semi-human machine. Basil looked at the woman on the table and thought about his limited options. Neither of his parents had gone to college, and as the only child, he swore to them he would make something good of himself. He was ambitious. He wanted more from life, but he was at a disadvantage from the start. It's a good deal if you ask me, Basil, Porter said. I'd take it if I were you. He thought for a moment. If I care for her, what would she be to me? Lex shrugged. A friend, a sibling, a wife, whatever you want, I don't care. Basil ran his hands over the shell. He felt the smooth skin and imagined what she could look like. As much as he didn't want to admit it, he could almost see a real person within this husk. Blonde hair, soft blue eyes, a wide smile, and a slim body. A college degree, a well-paying job, a wife. He was being handed the perfect life on a silver platter. It was all or nothing. Basil took in a shaky breath. I'll do it. Great, I'll see you Monday then, Porter said as he began to leave the room. Wait, but where am I supposed to start? Start at the foundation, Porter replied, then disappeared into the hallway. Basil knew what Porter meant. He needed to start with the neural network. The end.